On Now on the Launchpad, presented by Deloitte, Elbows Up, U.S. Politics and Canadian Ag. A panel discussion on what the future of agriculture looks like after 2 months of the Trump administration and the Canadian government on hold. Please welcome the panelists for this discussion. Tina Beaudry, partner with Deloitte. Grant McLellan, senior strategist, Prairie Sky Strategy. Levi Wood, farmer. And the moderator from Reuters, Ed White.
I'm always thrilled to get back here to Regina, where I'm from. As we were just discussing, Regina high school boy, and my mother and mother-in-law still live here. So it's great to get back to the hometown and see a bunch of farmers and the ag industry here. Today, I guess we're thinking about a question of what is the present tariff situation today. And if you haven't looked at your phone in the last 15 minutes, you really don't know, because every day sometimes it's changing 2 or 3 times. Which is hard for anyone to live their life by, and believe me, as a reporter, it's very hard to deal with that many changes in some days. For farmers, it's a time when a lot of guys don't need distractions. People are in their machine sheds, they're getting ready for another spring seeding season. The last thing they probably need to worry about is, are my crops going to be hit with tariffs once I harvest them? Is my livestock going to not be able to get into their main markets? Can I afford to buy a new, John Deere combine in a few months if Canada hits U.S. machinery with the retaliatory tariffs? So this is probably something right now that farmers don't want to deal with, but it's probably something that farmers really have to think through. So to that end, we have with us today a panel of 3 people who can help us think through that. What kind of decision-making and thinking do farmers need to have in mind, and what does Canada need to keep in mind as we go through this crucial time? So we've got 3 people before us, and I'll introduce each one in turn and then get them to introduce themselves a bit more than I would be able, and to go into just a few introductory remarks. So we're going to start first with Tina Beaudry, who's a partner now at Deloitte, but a former minister, and a person with vast government experience that knows how the actual machinery of government works. So if we can turn to you, Tina, and just get some ideas.
Well, great. Thanks very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It's great to be here on this panel today. I'm quite passionate about this area for a couple of reasons. One, everybody on this panel is a bit of political nerds, and so we certainly have a lot of things to say about the Trump administration tariffs and their impact on Saskatchewan. But in my former role as a minister, I had the portfolio of Innovation Saskatchewan and was responsible for setting up the Saskatchewan Technology Startup Incentive, which is the angel investment tax credit. It's the most aggressive one in Western Canada. And we also set up the Ag Growth Fund, which is now managed by the Emmertech Fund, and our friends from the Cultivator are here. And then in my role after that, went to the Chief Economic Growth role at Economic Development Regina, and was a founding partner in helping establish, along with the Cultivator, what is now the Ag Tech Accelerator. And so this is an area of great passion for me. What I'm most concerned about now is that a series of public policy decisions, and I will be a tiny bit political, have led to a situation that is really difficult for innovation in tech at precisely the moment where we need innovation in tech more than ever. So first off, we can certainly talk about the carbon tax. I'm sure my colleagues will speak to it, whether it's the industrial or consumer version of that, it's still a carbon tax. We can also talk about the capital gains taxes that were introduced by the government, which really sent a lot of our venture capital funds south of the border into other jurisdictions. It dried up our deal flow by about 22%, and that was pre-tariff. So that's been a big challenge for our tech and innovation partners across the board. And then third, some of the policies around keeping our ports open, supply chain, those sorts of things. And when you dry up the private sector capital for innovation, you lose a really important lever. And it means that when you have startup companies, they often follow where the capital goes, and that capital will take some of those companies that maybe start up here in Saskatchewan and take them down south or into other jurisdictions where the money is. And that's a loss, I think, for all of us here when we're trying to create jobs and productivity and manage productivity issues across the board. So maybe I'll stop there and I'll see where the conversation goes, but lots more to say on this as we proceed.
Thank you, Tina. And I will now turn to my direct right, Grant McLellan, Senior Strategist with the Prairie Sky Strategy and the former CEO of the Saskatchewan Cattle Association.
Correct, thanks very much. Very pleased to be here this morning to talk about this topic. It's certainly something that's front of mind, I think, for many of us in this room. My background is I grew up on a farm in Holdfast, just about an hour north of town here. My dad and brothers still farm there. In fact, my dad is sitting just second from the front here, just right there. He doesn't like any attention, but he was the one who really crafted a lot of my talking points on this. So if you don't like them, you can just go talk to him. After attending university here in Regina, I worked in the executive level of the provincial government for 10 years, including serving as Chief of Staff to the Minister of Agriculture and the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Trade and Export Development. My most recent position before joining Prairie Sky was as the CEO of the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. So hopefully today I'll be able to bring you a little bit of perspective on the implications of this type of policy on the beef cattle sector here in Saskatchewan and in Canada, but also talk about the broader agricultural sector and a little bit of stuff that work that can be done frankly, in trying to move these policies and get decision makers to influence the federal policymakers in the United States. So those are some of the topics I hope to touch on today.
Thanks, Grant. And I'm now going to turn to Levi Wood, who is to the far right. He is a farmer by Pence, Saskatchewan, which is just west of Regina. You have an aerial applicator business. And he also went to a very bad high school, Campbell High School, which is the hereditary enemy of Sheldon Williams. So turn to Levi now.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Ed. And that's probably a great bio. Like you said, my farm is just west of town here. I farm there with my family, my brother, my dad's still involved to a certain extent, my wife and my kids. I think it was interesting when they called and said, would I be willing to do this? And originally I was like, well, I don't know what I have to add. And I think some of the uncertainty that everyone is feeling in this room is probably the same uncertainty that I'm feeling. And I think we have some opinions, but I think as we go along here, it's going to be really interesting to see what the panel says that we can take away as primary producers. So looking forward to this anyway, and thanks for having me.
So we'll have Q&A in a bit. I thought I'd warm these people up and get them fighting and arguing with just some open-ended questions, so you can take it whichever way you want. I was thinking from, the farmer's perspective. There's, a terrible amount, unprecedented amount of uncertainty over access to a lot of Canada's biggest markets for most of our commodities. And can farmers in this environment afford to invest in growth of their farm and their farm businesses, or should they just be hunkering down to survive? And how do they balance that conflicting set of considerations?
We both looked at you.
Yeah, no, happy to start that. Ed, I think that is like the $1 million question. I think, we're looking at two things. One, we're looking at the tariffs, we're looking at the trade issues, we're looking at those impacts on the farm, which would have a significant impact really at any time of year, if it was July or September or December. But I think one of the real challenges that we have in primary ag right now is the timing. We're sitting here in March, so for this year, speaking about it, most of your crop plans are set, most of your capital expenditure plans are set. A lot of, if you were, taking on more land or renting land or buying land or any of that, that's taken place, prior to now. So I think one of the challenges we have when we see this is it's very difficult to react to this situation because of the time we're in. And I think it comes down a little bit to everyone's personal situation about whether they should be, continuing to expand or doing whatever. But I think right now, a real challenge is it's just very difficult to pivot in any really significant way right now. So that being said, I think we have to adjust to, the challenges we're facing now. And those challenges, especially on canola and peas and some other industries, are very significant. And that's doesn't just necessarily apply to ag. It applies really to all of our industries and all of our export industries in Canada, I would say.
Well, I think generally the theme there is plan for the worst and hope for the best. And I think ultimately a lot of the advice, certainly in the livestock sector, is we have to plan as though these tariffs are going to be put in place. We can't necessarily go hunky-dory and expect that these things may or may not happen. And I think you need to be prepared that the situation that we hope doesn't come to pass will. And ultimately, certainly in the livestock sector, when you're not an annual crop type of level of production, you're a multi-year plan for your operation. And certainly you're taking into perspective all the other risks that you're faced with. It's better to plan for those risks and account for those risks than it is to be caught flat-footed in a scenario where all of a sudden you don't have a liquid asset, you may not be able to move those animals to market, the packers may decide that they're not taking any animals, and you've got good prices right now, but that could very well evaporate in the next little bit. So we would encourage, and I think folks around the room know, that it's always best to have a plan in place for the worst-case scenario, and frankly, we're staring that in the face right now.
But I still think that this is one of the times that investment in innovation is important because the biggest challenges that we're facing in order to remain competitive in this highly volatile environment that is very politically unstable as well, which isn't helping investors at all, is that investment in innovation in tech is going to help at the input cost level to help manage input costs by using precision spraying and seeding, just as one example. It's also going to help with genomic breeding and so on. And I think it's really important to invest in tech in order to help manage some of those input costs and make better use and optimized use of resources. And then on the second side, we just, and we've been talking about this for I don't know how many years, Grant and Levi, but we need to do more value-added processing right here at home rather than take our raw commodities and ship it to the United States to be processed. I mean, that needs to happen here. And so thank God the provincial government had the foresight to establish the trade offices that they did many years ago, because right now they look pretty smart for doing that. But still, we're quite trade exposed. Deloitte has done a lot of economic scenario planning, and Saskatchewan, Alberta are some of the most trade exposed provinces, and so we need to plan for that. So investment in tech is very important. My worry is that the private sector investment in tech is going down, and it's with Trump saying, we're open for business and you're going to have zero taxes here. I think that's going to get worse. I'm worried about that. And that means the only other remaining lever to pull for technology investment is going to come from governments. And governments right now are also going to be feeling the pinch. They've only got so many resources, and some businesses and industries are going to need some support through this.
One thing that I was in a panel similar to this yesterday in Winnipeg, and what was brought up by some industry leaders was the idea that Canada's federal governments, provincial governments, and ag organizations have been a bit complacent with preparing for a day like today. They felt that as much as this is unprecedented, it's kind of come out of left field, maybe we've just taken market access everywhere for granted. What's your view on that? Is there anything we could have done to keep ourselves out of this nightmare that most agricultural exporters are in?
I'm going to steal this one from Tina first. I think there's folks in this room that have, made this opinion very clear with their votes, that at the provincial level and at the industry level, we have been telling the federal government for over a decade to be prepared for this exact type of scenario, that we needed to ensure that as a sovereign nation, that we need to protect our food supply, we needed to protect and build on our economy, we needed to build pipelines from east to west, and we needed to build a nation that could move product to other markets and reduce our reliance on the United States. The provincial government, to Tina's point, has been establishing trade offices across the world to build those marketplaces because the federal government had vacated that position, in particular when it came to marketing Saskatchewan agricultural products and our energy products. And so I think that there's no one in this room who hasn't beat their head against the wall in their shop or Quonset every time there's a federal government announcement that undermines the economic advantages that we have here in this province and in this country and in Western Canada in particular. And so I don't think it's any surprise in this room that at some point this problem was going to come to a head, and we've been saying for years, be prepared for this.
But what I would add to that is, I think we've seen in this week, at least, if you've been watching the news at all, and I feel like we're in COVID again, where we're watching the ticker tape at the bottom. You know, what's the, are we red, yellow, or blue today? Anyway, what I do think is calmer heads need to prevail, because, and you've seen even this week that Premier Doug Ford has kind of toned it down a little bit. And I think that's important, because if we look at the consumer basket of goods, and when Deloitte has done some work around this, the consumer basket of goods, which indicates the price index for a lot of things, about 15% of that comes from American imports. So Canadian consumers are going to feel the brunt of retaliatory tariffs as well. So there does need to be a temperate, moderate, measured, diplomatic approach to this, rather than we're going to fight the bully with the bully's tactics. I don't think that's going to help Canadian consumers here, or producers for that matter.
Well, I think your question's interesting, and for all industries, this of course matters and is important, but it's, I do think in the grain sector, it's kind of interesting. It's a little bit different than the cattle and beef sector, which is very, very, trade dependent on the U.S., and not to say the grain industry isn't. And the reason that is a couple of reasons. One, we've had trade deals, but two, it's low-hanging fruit. I mean, the idea to think that we're not going to trade in a significant way with the United States and in production agriculture is hard to believe. But I think that one of the challenges that we have right now is that, I would say to some ways in the grain sector, we actually have diversified some of our markets. And it's the combination of the tariffs from our two largest trading partners at the same time that are, creating most of the consternation. Like, I think it's very difficult, I think, from our standpoint as farms, is that, we've built our businesses, built our farms, ran our financial statements around the fact that we are dependent on trade. And I think trade has been our lifeblood in terms of, like, our ability to get our ports to market and our ability to get our our products around the world. I think what you're seeing now is a challenge is our lifeblood in Saskatchewan and Western Canadian production ag is our ability to trade with other countries around the world. We're never going to be able to use all our products domestically. And so now, I think if 6 months or a year ago, if you ask anybody, what are the biggest risks to our industry? A trade issue with the United States was probably like 50th on the list. I mean, it was so far away from even being a probability that, should that have been in more of a concept in someone's mind? Sure. But only 7 or 8 years ago, we did renegotiate, the Canadian-U.S.-Mexico agreement. And NAFTA was in place for 25 years before. So, it's very difficult to have even, proactively done much for this. When you look at it in terms of, just how low the possibility was that we expected this. I mean, we've been through this with China before, but the challenge really is the combination of factors and multiple tariffs, multiple bullets from different directions right now.
And, I know, Levi, you've been in farmer organizations and you've dealt with, farmer lobbying of Ottawa. And one thing I've heard quite a few times from politicians of all different parties is that they feel like they don't know what farmers want. Because they'll say, this group came in and said they wanted this. She came in and said she wanted that. That was the opposite. And these guys said this, and those people said something completely different. And that it can become maybe tempting for politicians to just listen to what they like hearing when they hear a lot of conflicting opinions among farmers and people in agriculture. So I guess the question for all of you is there some way, with the kind of vast diversity in the farm and agriculture industries, for people to get more consistent messages to Ottawa, so farmers and agriculture aren't just either ignored or things are coming out that really aren't kind of generally good from a farmer's perspective?
That is a good point. I mean, I have been involved in doing some lobbying over time in Ottawa, and and these thoughts extend to Regina too. I mean, it's not necessarily all that different, though there is obviously a proximity factor that plays in. I think definitely, I think ag does get segmented that way. You can see it with obviously the federal government and the way that they, do certainly choose which organizations they like the best. I do think though, as much as there are differences between ag lobby groups, there are a lot of similarities, and I do think that there's, some certain key themes which, have been probably come from all ag groups or most of the ag groups. And I do think that message is heard. I think the general themes are heard. Sometimes you see, specifics have maybe fallen by the way. Like you and I were talking earlier, there's been some challenges at the Port of Vancouver for 40 years. And those challenges exist in the same way, and it's the same thing. And I think, I think it's as much about is the ag lobby being fragmented. When you talk about trade and transport, though, I think it also involves other industries. There's lots of other industries need to move their products and need to export primarily through the few ports that we have. But I think when you look at that, I think it's more of like, ag has been a fragmented message in some ways, but in some ways it hasn't been. But I don't think there has necessarily been leadership around a cohesive strategy around ag specifically coming from Ottawa. And I think, I think part of it is the political will to do that when there is such a divergent groups across the country and across industries. It is a challenge, but I don't think we have had that strategy. And I do think the previous government got kind of close when they had Dominic Barton do his, ag report. I feel like that lacked a number of specifics, but it was trying to talk about ag in terms of the context of the whole country and how we can be a value driver in the country. But I don't think the will to take that has been there to take that much further.
I think the first key to this is being proud of our agricultural sector, period. Right? Like that has been a real challenge in having the representation that tells the story about the sustainability and productivity of our ag sector here in Canada. I think that's been a real challenge. And so when you don't have that, you can see the divisiveness that occurs as a result of some of the lobby groups, to Levi's point, right? But I think that is a really important story that needs to be told out of here. And I also think that if you just take this back to something that I think everyone can get behind, arable land is decreasing, the population is increasing, there is going to be global hunger. And we play a very, very critical role in this country, and particularly in this province, of solving that global challenge. And we need to be proud of that opportunity for us, that challenge for us, and we need to champion it at the front of the line instead of at the back of the line.
Well, now, frankly, I think that's a bit of a cop-out in terms of that question, right? Because, no, not yours, but from...
I was like, what?
From the perspective that they accuse agricultural organizations of not bringing similar viewpoints forward. To Levi's point, there are similar themes and similar asks, if not the exact same asks, across significant parts of the agricultural sector. I think they try and look for little nuances to try and find little wedges to place in between industries. For instance, Bill C-282, and we're talking about protecting one particular part of the agriculture sector from being trade exposed in any future trade negotiations. That's a way that they find those little pieces to divide. But if they really wanted to say that, just come to us with something you agree on and we'll do it. Well, get rid of the carbon tax. We've been saying that for 10 years. Get rid of capital gains tax. Don't do that. That's across every single sector of the agriculture sector, whether you're talking about supply managed or not. These are policies that I think, like I said, it's a cop-out to say, well, they tell us different things all the time. Well, no, a bunch of us have told you the same thing a bunch of times, and you still don't want to do it. So for you to say that just because they have a couple wrinkle issues here and there that are different, I think, like I said, I don't accept that at all.
Yeah, and you can see that, just to one layer on to that, you can see that in the response to the tariff, the Chinese tariffs on 100% on canola, versus, and I apologize dearly to seafood lovers, to what's happening to the lobster industry in the Maritimes, and I love our Maritimes friends, but if you think about the impact of canola globally in terms of food production and value-added processing is much, much greater, and it's been crickets on this, and so this encourages, I think, the divisiveness that we've seen.
Yeah, and it's good for everyone here today. It's kind of a newsy day to know that I think I always have trouble with my time zones, but in China, I think it might already be the 20th, which is when the canola tariffs are supposed to kick in. So we're waiting to see what really happens. And then there's China's investigation of supposed dumping of Canadian canola seed, which is the big one. And I'm wondering if the three of you have any thoughts on, I mean, China and how we deal with China, where we've had tensions, but they're a huge market, and now we have problems. Canada has problems with the American market. How do we deal with that market that is sometimes not a market over in Asia?
Well, I think we have to focus on Southeast Asia, and I think we need to focus on Europe, and I think we need to focus on many of the other jurisdictions where the province already has a number of trade offices. I think that's critical. I think we still have to work on our relationship with India, which is a major partner for us in terms of our pulses, and so those things need to be higher priority now than they've ever been before.
Well, I think we continue to be the rope in the tug-of-war game between the United States. I mean, we look at how we get played between the two of them, even going back to the Huawei scenario with Meng Wanzhou and that piece. We get asked by the United States to basically imprison her in Canada, or hold her in Canada. And at the same time, now we're in a scenario where we jumped into an electric vehicle tax or tariff, basically at the behest of the United States. And now they're going to leave us flounder on that. And at the same time, China's going to come over and see, well, okay, now Canada's weak and exposed because the United States is now victimizing Canada. And so they're going to take its opportunity to enforce and get trade policy out of Canada that they would like to see. And so this is obviously a perfect time for them because we're already, worried about what's coming from south of the border, and they coming out flank us on the other side. And they're not an ally of the United States by any means, I don't think. But it's certainly they're taking their opportunity to inflict greater pain on us, to move us out of that sphere.
Yeah, and I think, we have seen this before with China, right? I mean, the challenge, of course, is the combination of all these factors at once. But I do think with China specifically, we've had these issues. Like we just talked about Huawei. They told a couple, they wouldn't accept canola from a couple of our major grain exporters a few years ago. We have dealt with those, but often those seem to ebb and flow based on China's demand for our product as well. So, it's not to say that that's not a major concern and that we shouldn't do something differently with how we deal with China. But certainly in this case, it looks like, if we're going to look as a country as one thing we could possibly solve or do, I mean, I'm not a geopolitical expert, so I don't really know everything about this electric vehicle tax or tariff. But at the same time, it's like, it's basically saying, well, we're going to do this because you did this. It seems like there's a very clear roadmap to some kind of way to resolve that. The reality too with canola, and one of the reasons on my farm I probably haven't changed our seeding plans dramatically is, the canola balance sheet, the oilseed balance sheet is sort of tight around the world. Like it's not overly, supplied. So, are we, I guess, this is maybe hope, but it's like, are we, some of these issues we get from China often, become easier to deal with, or we can somehow get around them when they actually need our product again. I think if you look at the export sheet, China exported huge amounts of canola in the fall. And, so it's good timing for them, and it's sort of like interesting timing for them, but I think they have, purchased a lot of their product as well. So, my hope is, before we get to new crop, before we get to this year, that there is possibly a way forward on something we can do with them.
So we, excuse me, we are literally on possibly the eve of a federal election call. It could be tomorrow. A lot of people think it will be, or Sunday. In the next couple of weeks, no matter what, it's got to be within a handful of months here. So, for farmers and agriculture to not just survive, but to, thrive and prosper, in the next few years, what do we need from the next federal government, and what do we need from the next parliament, from everybody? What issues need to actually be paid attention to in the next few years?
Well, I'll speak to the innovation side, and I'll let my colleagues speak to the livestock and grain side. On the innovation side, you know, again, if private equity is drying up and flowing to where the capital is, and if Trump is saying we're open for business, come and invest here, and trying to reshore major companies into the United States, we're going to lose a lot of our ag, tech, and innovation companies to where the capital is going. And so there is going to need to be a counter pull to that. And my worry, again, is that right now the only lever we can pull are sort of government levers, and government coffers are full, and that money really should be spent on supporting producers through some of this tariff issue. And so, you know, definitely we need the federal government to hear, whoever that may be, that we need to have a much more competitive tax environment, so low or no taxes so that we can compete and prevent our companies from reshoring down south. That's number one. And number two, they need to pull whatever minimal levers they have to incent the private sector to spend and invest in innovation in the Canadian economy in whatever ways that they can, whether that's, you know, a tax break or an incentive in some small way while they're still trying to balance the books. It's going to be a very, very difficult challenge, but if we don't do that, we're going to miss the boat and we will not be competitive coming out of this. And so it's a very big challenge whoever that next federal government is, but we can't fall behind even further on the competitiveness piece on innovation in tech, or we're never going to catch up. It's the trajectory and velocity of change is just too fast.
Yeah, well, you know, and those are good points that, you know, are really relevant in ag as well, specifically. Like I think for anyone here, no one would be surprised to find out who I'm planning to vote for when the election's called, and it's not the people that have been running things for the last 9 or 10 years. So, you know, when you ask me what needs to change, I think it's like almost we need, you know, maybe not a complete opposite shift, but I think we need a lot of shift from what we've been doing. You know, and I don't even think that's an ag-specific issue. I mean, I think that's a Western issue. I think that's it's an issue for any export industry in Canada. You know, I think we need to get. I think the next government does not have an easy task. I think we've had, you know, regardless of who it is federally, I think we are facing a number of challenges external. I think we have a number of challenges internal. You know, I think we heard Team Canada. You know, I'm pretty sure at this point, Team Canada means Team Ontario, Team Quebec. You know, and I feel like that's just some way how Confederation's been set up, but that's maybe for another issue, another day. But, you know, so we're hearing these things, but we're not getting any action. We heard again, you know, oh, we need to drop all our interprovincial trade barriers. Like, where have we got one? No. Like, you know, it's like, it's really frustrating because I struggle regardless of which party gets in. And don't get me wrong, I really hope we have a change of direction here. I think it's a challenge. And I think, you know, in Canada, it's very difficult for us to break through some of our preconceived or sort of, you know, our long-standing traditions of how we've operated as provinces and as a country. So, you know, I really think we need to look at our focus as a country, what we are going to be focusing on. You know, I think we need to look at what we can do to increase attractiveness for investment in our country without question, and that's you know, that's large projects, small projects. You know, I think we need to look at our taxation policy. We certainly need to be more competitive. I mean, if we're going to have these tariffs and we're going to counter tariff, like, we are very uncompetitive if you look across the border. And so all those things, I think, are things that need to change. And that's, you know, I don't even really think that's ag specific, but it kind of is for sure. So I hope a new government will have a priority on the things that help to drive our country forward.
Well, I think if I can just distill that down, we need a government that is proud of the work that we do in this country and proud of what role we can play in a global world moving forward. And that means being proud of the industries that we have here, proud of our oil and gas sector, proud of our agriculture sector, proud of our mining sector, proud of every single thing we do that drives economic growth in this country. And frankly, I think we've been told by our federal government that we should be ashamed of what we do and ashamed of the way in which we do it, and we aren't acknowledging the way that we do it is actually better than anywhere else in the world. And until we have a federal government that stands up for that and tries to sell Canada on the globe as opposed to sell how good we can feel about ourselves if we stopped burning diesel, unless someone gets that message across and starts selling our product and expanding our markets across the globe and telling our story in more than one market, because the United States right now is a key priority to get normal relations back with that partner. There's ways to do that, I think, and that involves applying pressure at the state level and at the industry association level to ensure that we have good partnerships and relationships there. And also, we need to make the argument that we are truly a Team Canada approach here. And part of that is by coming with the same message from federal to provincial to industry, going to the United States and talking to individual producers as much as we can and telling them stories about, like the last time that Trump brought in tariffs against China, China was treating them unfairly. They were selling $12 billion a year worth of soybeans to China in 2017. Trump went to China, said, we're slapping tariffs on you. Sorry, we need a new deal. U.S. exports of soybeans dropped to $3 billion a year, and they have not since recovered. Even though industry associations said they've got a better deal now, they have never recovered. And why is that? Because China offset and went to procure from Brazil. And so we have to be aware, too, that some of these markets in the United States have to be aware that they are going to suffer, and we need to have these pieces in place. Talk about the United States and the beef sector. We ship 50% of our beef herd in Canada gets exported, and 75% of that goes to the United States. There are packing facilities in the United States that take up to 30% of their cattle from Canada. If those packing facilities can't meet their margins by having their plants at capacity, they are going to shut down. And then the price of cattle is going to drop because packers do what they do best, which is they manipulate the market if it's not in the best interest for their conditions. And then we will have a surplus of cattle, and then our packing plants will stop taking cattle until that price drops. And so we're looking at these cascading effects through industry, and our government, and that's why from top to bottom we need to have an approach where we're talking about individual producers across the border and how it's going to affect them. And that these types of actions are only going to accelerate the amalgamation, conglomeration, and growth of large farms and the disappearance of small farms and small producers. So they are actually making the situation that they want to get rid of worse.
One thing I often hear, and I'm not saying this is in any way true, it's just what I hear, and I'm a reporter, I don't have opinions. But with that disclaimer, I always hear people say that in terms of rural Western Canada, the Liberals don't care because they don't have any seats in rural Western Canada. And the Conservatives take rural Western Canada for granted because they have all the seats. And the NDP isn't much of a factor these days. And so there's nobody fighting over rural Western Canadian seats, and they become easy to ignore, the issues from rural Western Canada. So how, in such a starkly divided electoral map, do Western Canadian issues, rural Western Canadian issues, get a little more attention?
I think there's never been a time where you're going to get more attention than you are right now. Because we've seen almost a 360 on energy. Suddenly it's Canada's energy, right? And suddenly it's Canadian ag. And I don't think you're ever going to get more attention to some of our industries and our resource-based industries than you are right now. So from a strategic perspective, if we're going to make change here, this is the time when we're going to have some people that are going to listen to what those resource-based economies need. And I would add the innovation sector needs as well. I think there's an open ear because Canada's competitiveness is a real challenge. We've had pretty modest growth over the last 2 years, even before the tariffs came in. We don't invest very well in R&D. The deal flow, as I said earlier, is going out. So in order for us to remain competitive and meet the productivity challenges that are caused by labor shortages across all these sectors, we're going to have to do things differently, to both my colleagues' point. And so this is the time, I think, where we have the ear of politicians, and I think it's really important that we use it.
What do they say? Don't waste a good crisis?
Yep. I wasn't going to say that, but yeah.
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, I do agree that certainly this is, at the forefront. And I think it'll be interesting to see here. I mean, I think, we are, I really don't like the leadership. I'm really frustrated with sort of the leadership vacuum that's come in Ottawa with the pro-Oregon Parliament, the leadership race. We haven't really had a prime minister. We do now have a prime minister. So I'm willing to give him a little bit of benefit of the doubt here to figure out what he's doing. I'm assuming he's calling an election this week, but I mean, I am assuming that there is a plan. But no one has told us what the plan is. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of action on that front. I think that those are very concerning things. And so, I think the challenge is that we have to break through on this issue. And I hope that in some way that this issue is actually resonating in Ottawa. Because, if it is not dealt with, I think there's some really significant risks to this time what can happen. And, I just think, I think Tina's right. I think if anything, we have the opportunity to hopefully have this issue dealt with seriously. And I will say part of that reason, though, is probably because the tariffs, I'm not sure the canola issue is taken as significantly if we didn't have the threat of U.S. tariffs that impact everything across the country. So, we still need that threat to help increase the profile of the issues in our industry.
I think what I just heard you say, Levi, was that tariffs are a good thing.
No, I am not saying a good thing. I am just saying, when the impacts are felt outside of just one region, I think that can help a country as diverse as Canada.
Ever since the Meng Wanzhou and the Huawei matter came up, canola has been in the national mind. It's mentioned on the news all the time. People that had never heard of canola before. Now we have, remarkably, Canadian potash being discussed in the U.S. Senate and, across U.S. media. We've never heard, I guess we never expected Donald Trump to make potash great again, but it these days seems to be. You hear potash everywhere. People don't even know how to pronounce it in the U.S., and now they're talking about it. So I think you sort of addressed this a few minutes ago with some of your comments, but how does Canadian agriculture take this newfound fame of potash and canola and our cattle going to the United States and our piglets, which travel down to Iowa and Minnesota, and most people had no idea that we supply their herd. How does Canada's agriculture industry and farmers take advantage, like you were saying, of this crisis and this newfound fame of these humble commodities to get a little bit more acclaim, attention?
Well, and I think in a lot of cases, the agriculture sector probably has pretty close ties with counterparts down in the United States. Not just political understanding, but an understanding of the way of life, the culture. You can go down to a ranch or farm in the United States, and it looks pretty close to what it looks like here. These people have a similar lived experience, a similar shared experience, and I think in a lot of cases, now our northern states are probably a bit of an outlier in this scenario, but in a lot of cases these producers don't actually understand how integrated, and it's more so on the livestock sector, whether that comes to poultry, whether that comes to pork, or whether it comes to beef, how integrated these economies are and how integrated these industries are. And when I talked about 50% of Canadian beef is exported and 75% of that goes to the United States. That's 1 billion pounds of beef is going to the United States. And then at the same time, in Ontario, those same animals may cross the border back and forth 3 or 4 times, whether they're going to be finished up here, whether they're going to be slaughtered down there. But again, they rely on our capacity and our animals because they don't have the capacity in the United States with their beef herd being at about 1954 levels. They don't have the capacity to service their own domestic supply. And Canada doesn't have the capacity to eat our own domestic supply. And so this market has been integrated all the way down through till Mexico. And this is why when you talk about the country of origin labeling issues that came up back into the Obama administration, the challenges that even packing plants and producers down there were talking about, well, we don't want foreign beef in our marketplace. We want to just eat U.S. beef. But now all of a sudden your packing plant is going to have to invest in infrastructure to sort out these animals. And like I said, if they run out, they're 30% below capacity, they're going to shut down. And there's already plants that are shutting down in the United States. Tyson Meats shut down a number of its facilities. And so they're losing capacity to process these animals at the same time as their herd is decreasing. And people aren't being encouraged to see that herd increase over time. And it continues to follow that downward trajectory. And so we need to talk about the success of these industries is actually the success of all the industries. It requires all of us to be working together to maintain these systems, because ultimately these systems have been built up over 40 or 50 years. And you can't just flip the switch off on it and think that that's going to help you. And so these people are angry down in the United States, and we probably share that sentiment in a lot of cases with folks in this room. We're angry too. But you're angry for the wrong reasons, and your anger and lashing out in this way is only going to hurt you. And to Tina's point, if I could sum it up, and it's used in market discussions, capital moves from weak hands to strong hands. And so if you're not prepared for this in the United States, a lot of these producers already aren't, you're going to see continued consolidation, probably in a more rapid and expeditious manner than they're already seeing it, and that's what they're angry at, but they're going to make the problem worse. And so that's what we need to be talking about. We need to talk to them.
Yeah, and to Grant's point, just to pick up on a couple of things, the Premier yesterday talked about the deep integration of the food supply chain, and that, you know, very well done in terms of just outlining that for all of the guests that were in the room. I go back to the fact that the consumer price basket of goods, 14 to 15% of that comes from the United States. And then what people in this room can do, and to both Grant and Levi's points earlier, is talk to their industry associations and their counterparts across the border that they work with on a regular basis in their vendor supply chain. And the reason for that is in the first USMCA agreement discussions, and I don't think I'm going to be offside for saying this, what was really key in advocating on behalf of Saskatchewan's interests, and I was in government at the time, and Grant, you could back me up, was some of those cross-border state conversations. So those state representatives and those state governors were very, very important in the first Trump administration in negotiating on behalf of our producers and our industries at USMCA. So there's a really important role to be played for everyone in this room to really reach out to those cross-border connections in their vendor networks and in their supply chain networks to make sure that everybody is really clear on what the impacts are.
Yeah, well, I think you made a good point, Ed, because like when you hear U.S. politicians call it potash, you know that they're not really speaking about this. It's not a familiar topic for them. You know, I think if nothing else, as a country, I think a little bit for ag. I mean, you know, there's nothing good about what we're facing, but at the same time, I think maybe it does give us a bit of a jolt, right? Yes. It makes you consider what you didn't think. Like, it's almost the black swan event to a certain extent, right? It's like, now we're considering things we never thought possible. And with that regard, I mean, hopefully maybe we can take some of that disbelief, we're looking at the situation we're facing now, and convert that into maybe doing things we didn't think possible as a country. You know, I think we're hearing rumblings. I think it's talking about, you know, how can we improve East-West Trade Corridor? How can we improve our you know, trading relationships around the world? You know, we should be looking at our free trade agreements. You know, the challenge with it is, though, is I think production ag, I think as grain farmers in the Canadian prairies, we're some of the most efficient producers in the world in many factors, and including our stewardship of the environment. But trade has been our equalizer. I mean, trade is the thing that allows us to be 2,000 kilometers from the port in many cases. And so, you know, we need to consider the trade agreements we have and find out how many of those, you know, what can we rely on out there, and we need to work towards improving those relationships around the world. I believe that. You know, I think the challenge a lot, and what we're seeing though is, you know, I think the other side of this is there's also the tariffs that we are facing from the U.S., but there's the other side that actually could have a major impact on us as producers is the counter tariffs we're considering putting on our exports. Yeah. You know, or our imports, sorry. And I think that is possibly a bigger issue. And I think in ag, I think that's a very important point that needs to be made, that we understand as a country exactly what we're doing when we tariff some of those things which are heavily transported to the United States. For example, even on potash, a lot of the potash that we send around the world actually gets exported from U.S. ports, and that's just a trade flow. So it actually gets exported to the U.S., goes down to the PNW, goes out that way, which just helps take the pressure off of Vancouver, and there's a number of reasons why we do that. But now you're looking at that and saying, so we're going to, there's no, in the current legislation or the current proposals, there's no trade back for any kind of export that just flows through the U.S. So, you're looking at paying tariffs on those products, and then you have to ship stuff around the world. Do you just eat that? Maybe you can pass it on directly to a U.S. consumer, but it's very difficult to do that in other ways. So, I think the challenge we have is kind of looking very, precisely at what we're going to do and being careful on those counter tariffs, and hopefully we can find ways to improve our trade infrastructure through the country.
I'm going to hand it over in a minute for audience Q&A. So if you've got questions, be thinking them up and you can stick it to them. They're here and they can't get away for a while. But I thought I'd ask, typical reporter, I just asked nothing about doom and gloom and problems and terrible things like we've been discussing. But I wanted to ask something a little more optimistic, which is, farming is itself a very optimistic industry, profession, calling. Every year farmers take all they've got and plug it into the ground. They borrow money, put it into growing a crop. They grow a crop. It's a living thing. They steward it. In the fall, they harvest it to support people eating it, which supports more life. But at this time, with all this uncertainty, I guess there's a danger that some of that excitement might be hard to feel this year with so much uncertainty hanging like a cloud. How can farmers, I guess, move forward, with that excitement for spring, with that delight in putting in a new crop and moving forward?
Well, everybody's heard the old adage of you never lost a crop in March. And I think that is kind of an attitude that permeates production agriculture, whether it's cattle, beef, or, grain or any of our industries. So I think, I think it kind of sounds like I'm putting my head in the sand a little bit, but even for me, I'm like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to grow my best crop ever this year. And there are a lot of things out of my control, but that's kind of the attitude that every one of us, I think, takes in March, is that this is going to be a great year, and that things will kind of work out. That being said, that doesn't mean you ignore risk management. That doesn't mean you ignore your, look at your plans, have a hard look at your organization, all that kind of stuff. Those are the things we're doing. But I think, honestly, as farmers, I think we are optimistic. I do think as much of a challenge as we're facing in the short term, in the medium to long term, these things will work themselves out. So it's like, it's a little bit of what do we do in the meantime. And the idea of not wasting a crisis is a good one, because I think it's a great opportunity for us as producers, as a province, as a country, to really look at what we're doing and figure out how we can improve on that gives us sort of exponential gains as we go forward in the future.
Well, I think one of the unique spots that the livestock sector finds itself in right now is that prices continue to be as good as they've ever been. And the futures market, as of a few days ago, was still looking at kind of record highs. So it's an opportunity really to ensure that your business is de-risking in as many potential ways as possible, and that you're being extremely thoughtful and deliberate about the activities you undertake. And again, making sure that you're utilizing the tools that are out there in terms of your business risk management programs and the suite of tools that are available outside that. And maybe revisit some of the programs that you haven't participated in before, what opportunities there are as well to diversify your operation. And are there opportunities to be found? But I thought when you said optimistic, and I thought about cattle producers, and I thought, have you ever seen one of them look at a weather forecast? Not much optimism usually, but at the end of the day, you are going to be faced with this scenario whether you like it or not. It's one more risk that comes to your business. And one thing farmers and ranchers are very good at is dealing with risk. That's their whole business, is mitigating risk. And so ultimately, this is another piece that they need to work on. But I think you have to look on really what do you have in front of you, and how do you think with all this other unpredictability, are you still going to work on your succession planning and work on your business growth strategy, and what other tools are out there that you haven't thought about using that now might be the opportunity to start adopting some of those processes?
Yeah, and to that point on the tools, I mean, we're sitting at Canada's Farm Show, which is a great opportunity to see some of the best innovations that are available in the agricultural industry. And I've noticed as I've walked around, some of our industry partners have put out signs that they're manufactured here in Canada. And so it's an opportunity, I think, to rethink some of the vendor partnerships that farms have. That's the first thing, and supporting some of our local manufacturers, our ag manufacturers. And then on the second thing, you know, looking for those technological opportunities that'll help at the farm gate with productivity, will help control some of the input costs, and all of the rest of it that is on full display here.
So if we now have, and I have trouble seeing through these lights, do we have a mic out there for a Q&A? I do. I see Caitlin with it there. So there we go. If anyone has questions for the panel, please wave your arm.
Very bad. Oh, okay.
You have better eyes than I do.
I just want folks to know that this is my wife's uncle, and I did not plant him, and I have no idea what he's going to ask.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I know you're, and I mean, you know you're in Saskatchewan, you have familial collections, connections to two people on a four-person panel. Hi, Levi. So in 1988, Canada signed the first trade agreement with the United States, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And during that time, I asked the negotiators what was the real benefit of the trade agreement. And they said it would be to reorient Canadian business to really value trade and get out and expand into the world beyond just the US relationship. So in that year, we probably had 80% of our exports going to the United States. This year, we have about 80% of our exports going to the United States. So the question is really about complacency of business, that we have terrific markets in places like China and the United States, but the new markets, and if we want to diversify, are going to be in more difficult places. And is Canadian business in ag and autos and all these sectors prepared to make the time and the investments to really diversify beyond our traditional trading partners?
So I think, I will say I think the provincial government has done a good job of that, a little bit of foresight there in establishing trade offices globally, right, including in markets in India, in Germany, in Singapore, and in other places outside of the United States. We still are trade exposed in the United States, as both Grant and Levi have pointed out, but I think that work has already started. And for producers, you do need a bit of government support to do that work, because not many producers can get out on the trade junkets on their own to market their products on their own. So there's a role for government to be played there. One of the reasons why the Saskatchewan government stepped into that role was because they didn't feel it was being played at the federal level, just speaking frankly. And so support for those things, I think, was really important and needs to continue and probably accelerate. And I'm sure you're going to see more of that.
And I would say from the perspective of the beef industry, I think part of your question is right. Complacency is there. What's the easiest or the path of least resistance to get things places? But recently, certainly not just with the support of the provincial government, with the support of national organizations like Canada Beef and the Canadian Cattle Association, they've been working very deliberately and diligently to access markets in Southeast Asia, particularly Japan, Korea, Vietnam, have been some places that have been targeted and identified. And in fact, Japan just last year passed Mexico as the second largest importer of Canadian beef. And so we continue to work on those pieces in that industry and in that sector, and the livestock sector in particular, but generally the livestock sector faces a different challenge. We don't have the supply to necessarily meet the demands of those countries. They want more, and they can't necessarily get more. And part of this process that might come out of this is that you're diverting now more animals that typically went for slaughter into the United States, but we also then need packing capacity, and that now we're in the chicken and egg scenario. We don't have the capacity here right now to even process all the animals that we have in Canada. So it does get a bit hairy when you start to look at that. But I think there's been a lot of active effort, certainly in the since the renegotiation of NAFTA to CUSMA, to target and expand and diversify those market access points.
You know, it's a good point. I think that certainly just echoing what they've said, you know, I think there is some really good work happening. You know, I think we are, as an industry or as a province or Western, trying to capitalize on these opportunities. You know, what I struggle with, and I don't want to sound up here that I'm just, you know, constantly, you know, frustrated with the federal government, but I feel like, you know, in ag, these things sort of never matter until they matter on the trade irritant side. But I think that also pushes on the other side, is that I don't think we have the leadership necessarily at times to go out and actually pursue the opportunities to the same extent that we could, because it doesn't matter and sort of until it matters. You know, and I think absolutely. I mean, the province has done, you know, some good work around the world. I think certainly on that, trade offices and such, that have really helped on that. But you know, the other side of this is we're very preoccupied right now with China and with the U.S. But you know, from an ag perspective, especially a grain side, you know, we are still dealing with the fallout of the impact of some of these issues that we're having in India. You know, and that's not even for the most part an ag specific or a trade issue. You know, that's more of an overarching political issue, it feels like. And I understand that things take time and diplomacy is slow moving and, you know, it takes a long time. But it's like, it doesn't feel like, to a certain extent, we are actually actively trying to impact in a significant enough way the relationships we have that primarily feature ag. You know, it feels like ag is often a tag along to the other sort of geopolitical priorities of our government.
Thank you. You guys are fantastic. And one of the things I really liked is the idea that we need to diversify our province. And it comes from the government, it comes from trade, it's across all the industries. So I'm really curious, as where do you think that comes from? So is it government, is it lobbyists, is it trade? There's lots of reasons to make that happen. So I want to ask you, how does that happen? How do you get general public? How do you get everybody to know what's happening in our industry, and certainly the tariffs, but how do they understand what's really happening in any given place?
I can answer this a little bit, and it's something I always heard from my dad for a long time is, why do I grow all this durum and I send it to Italy so they can turn it into pasta so I can send it back to me and I can buy it at the grocery store? So it's part of that is it's always been discussed, I think, at the producer level, is why the heck am I sending this stuff somewhere when we can do it here? We have the product. And finally we're starting to see some of this bear out, you know, with our canola crush facilities. Why were we sending our canola somewhere else to be crushed? And so if we don't want to necessarily rely on, you know, what is generally understood to be a poor infrastructure network for transport across this country. So why not do it close to here? Why not get rid of the problem that we always complain about that's always been there? And I don't know if until recently that there's been any political will to change that. And so, but to do that also requires the ability for policymakers and decision makers to create and foster an environment that allows for private investment and capital, because we cannot do this. Every time the government tries to do it, I mean, think of Budgate. Every time the government tries to do this and force it and artificially insert itself, it fails. And so this needs to be, they need to step back, create the environment, provide the incentives, and allow private sector capital to move in here. And we've already got, I think, the stability piece built in, at least at the provincial level, but the federal level has not come along to this concept. And now I hope that now that we've got this in our face, that we can start to think about these things and they can start to consider that we need to do more here, reduce our regulatory red tape, reduce the timelines that it takes to get these projects built, and really push to get things built as opposed to find little roadblocks along the way to make sure everyone gets their piece of the pie.
It's competitiveness and productivity, the two biggest things. But I would also say to your question, Pam, I mean, the industry knows all of this already. It's the average person out there that doesn't know this already. And I think it's really important. I think on the first night that we were here, Ag in the Classroom was recognized as with one of the Innovator Awards. And I think there's a real opportunity to go beyond the industry and the sectors to our local classrooms and have large-scale conversations in the curricula about where people's food comes from and how their food is produced so that we can be proud of that story. Our 4-H's and Ag in the Classroom have been doing a fantastic job of that, but it's the urban kids that need to learn that better, and Farm Show and Agribition have done a great job of bringing school kids here to help tell that story. But you know, that urban-rural divide, which is what I like the Farm Show and Agribition for, it's they bring rural and urban together to talk about how our food is grown and in this country is really important, but we need to do more of that, and we need to make it a lot more mainstream than it is right now.
That's a good point. I was waiting to hear your answer because I thought that was really an answer for a retired cabinet minister. But yeah, you know, I think it's a challenge. I mean, I think certainly it's a challenge. I don't mean a new challenge. It's a challenge that's always existed and one that people are working on. You know, we did talk about it before, though. I think, you know, and my point was going to be that there is still an urban-rural divide. And we talk about, you know, right now it's us in the U.S. We always, you know, or us in Central Canada or whoever. There's always, we talk about the things that divide us. And I think, in general, we don't talk enough about the things that actually unite us or we have in common. You know, and interestingly, I mean, I live in Regina, and I certainly feel, you know, we talked about the opportunity about ag's possible prominence on a federal level right now or around Canada. I think that exists in Saskatchewan right now too. I mean, a lot more of the people I encounter in my sort of life, just with my kids and everything, they're talking about canola and they're talking about tariffs and they're talking about everything more than I've ever heard anyone say before. You know, so it actually is an opportunity here, I think, to have that conversation around what, you know, what is kind of our vision in Saskatchewan, what is our vision in the province and federally, because I think there are a lot of people united around this right now. And I mean, hopefully that will also, you know, consider the importance of primary agriculture. You know, you were, even in Saskatchewan, you know, maybe 30 years ago, you were one generation away, most people, from a farm. You know, now we're getting 2 to 30 generations away, depending where you were born around the world. And so I think, you know, we need to do a good job of conveying that message, and I think that's an important challenge and opportunity of our time right now.
You know, while we're looking for a question for the crowd, I have one I'd like to follow up with that you mentioned about canola crushing. This is Regina. We're supposed to be becoming like we, as a former Regina guy, saying Regina is supposed to be becoming the mecca of canola crushing, biodiesel production in Western Canada. It's stalled in a big way. There's a lot of disappointment. I know south of the border we have the same thing because the U.S. industry doesn't know what the Trump administration is going to do with biofuels policy. What do we do about that? There's been so much investment in value added with canola in Canada, and all of a sudden it just seems to be hitting the brakes. So where do we go from here?
Well, number one, you need to remove the 100% tariffs, which is first order of business. And the second order of business is there still is a lot of opportunity. I mean, if you look at aviation fuel as one example of a space that needs significant investment, and there's opportunities there for canola oil and reprocessing into aviation fuel opportunities. This is a big deal for the Regina and surrounding area. And so there's a lot of jobs that those facilities will bring to this region, which is really important. And so we need to do whatever we can. We're coming up to an election. We need to make sure that there is ag policy in every single platform that comes out of every single candidate in the upcoming election. And we all need to be very discerning voters when we look at those things, because even though you may not specifically be in the ag sector, and I'm sure most people in this room are, you are affected very much by what happens in our ag sector. That our economy is what drives our social programs. And so if you want to talk about wait times in healthcare, or you want to talk about classrooms, the only way you're going to be able to afford that is to sustain and grow and support the industries that actually create wealth in our communities. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to really take that forward and make sure that all the parties are speaking to it.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to, and when you look specifically at the canola crush industry right now, right? I mean, I think Cargill's coming to tell us they're still going ahead with the plant here later today, which is terrific news for all of us. But it's also about what happens with the next one. There is a bunch of, there were some other canola crush plants that have been on this board table, some moving ahead at better speed than others, but it's a challenge now in this environment, because I believe in the head office of all those companies, they are currently wondering why they should build anything in Canada. And I think that's the risk. I mean, the stuff that's in progress, our industry, our firms, we will adapt. We can find ways around this. I think we will. But I think it's, how do we continue to attract investment? How do we continue to attract these major projects which help drive our province? How do we do that in an environment in which, in many ways, and it's the problem with these tariffs, because there's very little we can actually do about it, to encourage, companies to actually invest and build here when they're looking at this major trade issue. And so, I think it's a major challenge of how we actually are going to focus on encouraging investment, development, and in Saskatchewan, because we absolutely need those things to drive exactly what Tina was talking about.
And just before Grant goes, in order to attract other capital to the ecosystem, you have to have those anchor tenants. And so if we lose that anchor tenant, that is a real risk to the rest of the ecosystem.
I don't have much to add to that. At the end of the day, it is about, and it has always been, how do we continue to attract capital to this province? And how do we continue to build on those industries? And I think there is definitely some reluctance and some, hesitance by anybody right now that's looking at Canada as a whole for investment. And this has been, we saw over many, many years, but especially during the onset of the particular government at the federal level that we have now, capital fleeing this country and capital leaving this country. And so we do need a reinvigorated federal government, whomever that may be. But they need to start to take very seriously that we need to be attracting capital here. That's something obviously the United States is trying to do with their policies. I think they'll find in a lot of cases they're going to do the exact opposite. And so how do we make ourselves a partner that other countries can look to and other private sector organizations can look to draw that capital? Because I think there's actually an opportunity here for us to show that we are a stable organization, that we have a stable government, and that we have predictable policies. We need the good policies, and we need the right policies, and I think our next government needs to really kick up their approach in being very deliberate and aggressive in drawing that capital here.
And I think we have time for one quick question and quick answers, if there is, and I believe right over there to my left.
Sure. Thank you. Excellent presentations by all the speakers. My name is Zenith Fay. I'm from Foam Lake, Saskatchewan. And my question is going to be preluded with a little bit of a background first. And it is in the area of what producers can do. I've been involved with producer commissions. I see the lovely field of canola in the background, and barley and wheat that we all grow. What can producer commissions do because we were evolved and developed to have dollars from producers. Everybody in this room, whether you're a livestock producer, hog producer, poultry producer, you put dollars into research, market development, and extension. So now we're at the point where we have these tariffs, and all the province has done a wonderful job in developing, hindsight foresight is very good in developing trade export offices around the world. So as producer commissions in the area of barley, we take the checkoff dollar and invest it in research. About 70% of our research dollars of our checkoff dollar goes towards research, new developments of varieties or agronomic issues, etc. And the other 30% between market development, working with other organizations to develop more export ability or users of our product. We now have the other part of this, before you answer my question, what the producer commissions can do is that we have amalgamation of the export industry in this country. We have the Bunge, Viterra, etc., all getting bigger. So they are out there and they're telling us that we are doing the market development work for you. But they're order takers, because it doesn't matter, because they're a global company. Whether they sell, example, barley from Canada, or they sell it from Australia, or they sell it from some other country, it's their bread and butter. They develop the market and they can sell whatever the cheapest product is to that end user. So having said that, example of wheat has 57 markets. Barley has 7. So we have a gap. So my question is to put the two together, producer commissions and developing the markets for our products.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think you discussed a lot of it right in what you're saying, right? I think it's about how I think our challenge in our markets around the world is that I think we need to have, a very specific strategy as a country of who we're going after. And it's the challenge I think we've had is that ag in many of these areas has been a tag on to other interests in the region. And I think that as producers, one of my plugs though is going to be too, is that for all the farmers in the room, one of the things that we can do is actually get a little more involved in our producer commissions. I know just the last couple of years, there's been some of them haven't even had enough people run to fill the board seats. It's had to be acclaimed or had to be, the government's had to appoint someone. So in terms of those priorities, I think as farmers, we should be taking that more seriously. Those commissions do a lot of work for us on the research side. They do a lot of work on the connection side. They do a lot of work on, on building relationships and here and around the world. And I think that's really important. I think, obviously, as a country, I think as producer groups, there's only so much we can do on our own. If one group can only have so much impact, but that impact can be magnified when we do it with others and I think it's, I think in ag we need to find some cooperation, but I would definitely encourage all the producers here to take a good look at your provincial commissions and be involved with them.
Well, I think having been employed by a producer group just recently, I want to echo Levi's comments is my SCA had a board of 16 directors, and I think the last time there was an election was just about a decade ago. And so it's really about making sure you're getting involved, and you want to make sure you have a say in where your checkoff dollars are going. And just like we had a mandate to fund research and innovation and not necessarily market development, right? That market development falls to some of the national bodies. And so it looks at, are you sticking to your mandate, or are you entering an opportunity or a field of opportunity where you can start to expand that mandate a little bit, because the marketplace is so different than it was 20, 30 years ago. How many grain buyers are there now compared to 20 years ago? Microscopic almost compared to what it was. And so you need to, again, get engaged, and we encourage everyone in this room, if you pay checkoff, get on one of those commissions and make sure you're talking about these things. And frankly, then start to work together. And these commissions do, from time to time, as we talked about, find common ground. But I think it's more important now than ever to really align and find these messages, because all of those voices, when we're a chorus singing from the same song sheet, are much more powerful than all of us trying to talk over each other.
And with that, we've run out of time. And I would very much like to thank all three of our panelists who have blessed us with their time and their well-grounded thoughts, which is what we all need in this time of uncertainty. So with that, I think we should all thank our panelists. And that's it, folks. So thanks for attending this session.